In Titus 2, older women are commanded to teach what is good so they can help younger women love their husbands and children. On today's show, you'll hear from older women who will share timeless, relevant biblical wisdom and personal, profound life experiences to help answer your questions and teach what God says is good so you can be the wife and mother you were created to be. Welcome to another episode of Older Women Likewise.
Good evening, and welcome back to Older Women Likewise. Hi, Cindy. Hi, Laurie.
Hello.
We are so glad to have Laurie Moyer with us this evening to talk about Bible submission. But first, we want our viewers to get to know a little bit about Laurie first. Cindy and I both know that your husband is Laurie Moyer, a Bible evangelist in the Lord's Church, and that you've been married for 34 years. But tell us some about your children and those grandchildren.
Yeah, the important part, right?
Right.
I have 3 kids. I have 2 boys and a girl. The boys are both married and have their own families. So I've been blessed with 7 grandchildren. Precious prodigies, every one of them.
Very nice. You told us earlier that you have a degree in biblical studies, but I found it interesting that you felt like the best way to learn about the Bible was intensive reading. Could you elaborate on that for us?
Sure. A degree should give you tools to help you learn with, but it is not an end in and of itself. A degree is a starting point, and learning is an activity. The most crucial thing you can get in your Bible study, the thing that will be the biggest tool to you, is an absolute desire, a thirst to learn, to see things that connect together. That's going to be something that anyone can have. And yes, if you go through a degree, hopefully the thing you'll get the best out of that is an awareness of how little you actually know, not the opposite. So if you start with that desire to know, and then you put it together with an honest heart that's willing to actually see what's there, not just defend what you think you already know, then you're in the best position to learn everything. And it's not going to be...
We seem to have lost some volume. Am I missing something, or?
I don't know. I can't answer that question. The idea of wisdom...
I've read some of your articles for women that are posted on searchingdaily.com. It is really good information, well presented, which is one reason that Cindy and I are pleased to have you with us this evening to discuss in loving submission.
Well, first thing I'd like to do, if we can, is talk about the contrast between what the Bible describes submission as and what the world wants to tell you it is. And what we need to do is not just let the world define those terms for us. Submission is something that we are shown first and foremost through Jesus. That is the main point I'd like for us to remember from tonight. It's not just something you learn from a person that you hear said by somebody about the Bible. The way you get there is by reading the Bible itself. And you will see there are patterns there that present themselves. There are principles that are a deeper level of finding things out. Well, when the world thinks about the term submission, they are reacting to what historical things have done to them. They think about someone that's taken advantage of. Maybe they say that if you give somebody an inch, they'll take a mile. And so you don't dare let your guard down or not stand up for yourself because nobody else is going to do that. Problem is, that's not the way the Bible asks us to focus our lives. We're not about defending ourselves. We're about allowing God to take care of the justice and the defense that we might need. And I think we can see that more clearly in 1 Peter 2. 1 Peter 2 talks about how in verse 21 we have Jesus, who is our supreme example. We have been called according to the purpose of Christ. He suffered for us. He left the example for us to follow. First thing it says is that he didn't sin. There was no sin there, so we know we can do that too. But verse 23, he was reviled, but he did not revile in return. He's suffering, but he did not utter any threats. Instead, he entrusted himself to the one who judges righteously. He was not interested in defending himself and standing up for himself in those cases. And we're talking about his lifetime of mistreatment and culminating in his death on the cross. He had so many moments where he deserved so much better than he got. So ladies, if you think ever in your life there's a danger that you're not going to get everything you deserve, you have someone here that can relate to you and that you can relate to. Jesus was not interested in battling for fairness for himself because his bigger goal was to take care of our needs. He saw something we could not do for ourselves. He submitted himself to the will of the Father in order to serve us by giving us something we needed. So verse 24 there in 1 Peter 2, he bore our sins in his body on the cross so that we might die to sin and live to righteousness, because by his wounds we're healed. So if Jesus could take that step back and say, I'm going to do what God needs me to do in order to serve a bigger purpose, I don't see how we could possibly fight against that sort of an approach. That's the way we need to focus our lives.
I would totally agree. He's the ultimate example of what we have always respected throughout history. I mean, throughout history, those who have selflessly humbled themselves, and I mean, they've served as an inspiration. I think about people who risked their lives to hide Jewish people during the Holocaust, or the men who gave up their seats in the lifeboats at the sinking of the Titanic, the New York City firefighters that ran through flights of stairs toward the flames on September 11th. All of that was honorable. But then when we come to the submission of women day by day to the needs of their families or the leadership of their husbands, this is also a very noble thing to do in honor of God. And Christ, as you've just mentioned, he's the ultimate example. And let's follow just that beautiful, beautiful selflessness. So beautiful.
So what we see then, when we look at the scriptures, is a very clear set of directions given to women. We can't rationalize that away. I know our society would like to say, well, that was for a specific time and period. But when we read what those passages say, they are clear. First, I think the one that we probably are most familiar with in general would be Ephesians chapter 5. Verse 22 tells women to submit to their husbands. There's no way around that. It just means what it says. And it says in everything too. We'll talk about what that doesn't mean in a few minutes. But first off, let's get what it is saying. We have to be people who know how to submit to our husbands. Colossians 3 verse 18 mentions the same thing. 1 Peter 3 verse 1, that set of verses immediately following 1 Peter 2, where it talked about Jesus's example, it goes right into saying how women need to be submissive in the same way, it says, to their own husbands. And that this is going to develop a sort of character in women that will be meek and quiet. And it won't be about being pretty on the outside as much as being pretty on the inside, because that is what is precious to God, a meek and a quiet spirit. So that's where our emphasis should be. Now, when the Bible defines our place in this world, starting in Genesis 1, it talks about how God made man and woman in his image. It's not just a man made in God's image. It's both male and female, Genesis 1:27 says. So it is both of us. And we each have specific characteristics that I think we see God's character in. Now, that doesn't mean we are exact carbon copies of each other. Am I right, Cindy? I mean, you're not really that much like Mark, right? Yeah. Okay, well, I know I'm not identical to Doy either, but what this means is we each have our own special niche. We have our aptitudes. And when we use those things that we can do so much better, we are capitalizing on our individuality. Now, the Bible doesn't say you need to be little carbon copies of each other. Instead, it tells men to do things that God knows men are better at and better suited for. And it tells women to do other things that, since he made us, he knows we are going to be better at. And we're filling each other's needs when it comes to our relationships in a family, or even apart from marriage, our relationships within the church. Everyone is not identical. We are complementarian in that way, which could mean we walk around and give each other compliments, I suppose, but mostly it means one person does one part and the others do different things. It's like Romans 12 and 1 Corinthians 12 that talk about a body being many different parts and each has their own need, and you don't downplay anyone else for not being the same as you. You value them and you use them. So when we see the New Testament saying, for instance, in 1 Corinthians 11, verses 3 and verse 9, that man was made first, and that gives him a headship, it's repeated in 1 Timothy 2, verses 11 through 15 there. 1 Timothy 2 says that a woman is not to teach or usurp authority over a man, but instead she's supposed to learn in all silence. Whew, that's a hard one. But she's supposed to be a learner. And then it follows that up with saying the reason is because man was made first and then woman. Does that seem arbitrary? Well, maybe it seems arbitrary to some people, but here's the thing. God made us and gave us this order. So he's the one that picks the rules. Right. He chooses the leaders. He helps us be the best people we can be by filling the role he's given to us.
Yes, and look how well he did at the rest of creation. To me, when you see all of the basic laws of science and all the elements that work together in every system of creation, it's perfect. You know, like, I'm a big fan of gravity. Like, it really comes in handy. He did a good job with that. So this same God who created those laws that prevent so much chaos during our stay on this planet, let's trust him with these other laws, these relationship laws. He knows what he's doing. His creation is perfectly designed, and this is his design to bring out the best in men and the best in women. And so, to be specific, his instructions when it comes to marriages should look like this. A husband, day in and day out, happily knocks himself out to bring joy to his wife. And then when it's her turn to sacrifice her preferences, that cycles around, it feels more like a great opportunity to pay down a debt a little bit than it feels like you're being put upon. That's what the cycle, that's what he has in mind. And so you see all these beautiful cycles within creation, whether it's the planets or whether it's the weather or whether it's the life cycle of each year, in the winter, spring, summer, fall. I mean, there's a cycle in our relationships of the husband loving, the wife feeling gratitude, him asking her something, she feels in debt, like, yes, I'll do that. For all you've done for me, I don't feel put upon. And that's a cycle that is God designed. He knows what he's doing, no matter what the culture. Like, what we're saying tonight, controversial. Like, this is not the trend.
Good points, both of you. Really making really good points about that. And I just, the beauty of creation and the beauty of how things, as Laurie says, how they all fit together. That complementary life for us is exactly what's good for us, and God knows what's best for us. So keep on, Laurie, doing great.
Well, I think the next thing it would be good to notice at this point is that submission in the Bible is always voluntary.
Right.
It's not something that anyone else is told to subject another people or another group of people for any reason.
Exactly.
When you talk about Ephesians 5, it's that the woman is supposed to be subject to her husband or to submit to her husband. Some of the different areas say it's a voluntary thing she does. So she could do it grudgingly, don't want to do this, but since I have to, I will. And you know what kind of a heart that's going to give you, don't you? You'll be resentful. It will be an ugly thing. It will not be useful to you or anyone around you. And quite honestly, I don't like anybody doing something for me that I can tell they just don't want to do it. So when she willingly submits, just like the church submits to Christ, which is what Ephesians says, that's the parallel there, then it's something you do gladly. Yes, the husband is told even more. It takes longer, actually, there in Ephesians 5 to describe how much the husband is supposed to sacrifice for his wife, just like Christ gave himself up for the church. So there is nothing in what he's asked to do that is easy for him. There is nothing in a woman being subject to her husband that is more difficult than him being willing to give himself up for her. So yes, all of that goes back and forth. And when it's done willingly, when it's done from a heart that wants to serve, you can find joy in what you do. Think about it for a minute. If you're talking about the service that you give your children, little children especially, they depend on their caregivers, whether it's mom or dad or grandma, whoever it is there. They need that sort of help. And if you begrudged everything you did for them, it would develop a sour person, not just in you, but in that child. But when a mother sees that her child is hurting, that they need help, that they're up sick late at night, I mean, she could roll over and go back to sleep and just ignore them, but that is not what love does. Because love says, you need something, I'm going to fill that need. And that is an attitude that we bring into all of our other relationships. With our husband, yes, but even with other members of the church. Someone has a need and I want to fill that for them. I want to lift them up. I want to encourage them. And so that develops a willing servant heart.
It's so powerful that we can choose our attitude, that it's a conscious decision. We can choose whether to willingly give and to give out of love, and as opposed to grudgingly giving, that we can choose our thoughts. And I think that is something worthy of our prayers. If we're struggling with the desire to serve our families in the way that we know we need to, that is something that we can ask God, please give me the desire to, have a better attitude about this demand or that demand. Help me to feel it. And so, yeah, we always want to give from the heart. You made such a good point of, if somebody is not being a cheerful giver to you, it's like, oh, you can keep it. But yeah, God, we want to serve our families from our hearts because they sense that. They don't want to feel like they're a burden to us. They want to know what a blessing they are to us. So I appreciate that point.
That's really good. And you're right about that. Absolutely. That it's the voluntary nature of it that is the beauty of it. As you were talking, I was reminded of driving and the right of way. You never take the right of way. It's always given. You always give the right of way. And that's what makes driving possible, because somebody has to be first when they all come up to a four-way and so forth. And that's what makes our lives with our husbands comfortable, pleasant, and godly.
Absolutely. When we are humble in our spirits, we don't just think, oh, I'm not much. Don't do anything for me. You just go ahead and go on, and I'll do what I can to keep, that's not humility. And even C.S. Lewis said that humility is not thinking, how was it that he put it? Humility is not thinking less of yourself, but thinking of yourself less. The idea that it's not about me. I am not the center of our universe. And so anything I can do to help somebody else out. And really, that's a formula for happiness in general, when we're not focused on ourselves, but we're focused on other people.
Yes.
But when we think about the idea of being submissive, we're not saying that's a position you take because you don't think you can do anything else. Yeah, the world might look at it like, okay, a vanquished army is going to submit to the conquerors. That's not the submission we're talking about here. We're talking about someone who can do many great things, who has great ability, but instead has self-control at the same time. And again, I can't say that without thinking about Jesus. All the things he could have done. And we do sing the song. He could have called 10,000 angels to stop what was happening to him on the cross, but he didn't. It was love that held him on that cross, because he knew if he didn't go ahead and do it, we were the ones that were going to be suffering even more than whatever he suffered. So we need to stop and think about that when it comes to our own ability to do things. It's about doing what's best for the greater good overall and for the people that we love. So a woman might be very good at many things that she just doesn't need to take on and try to be the key mover and shaker for, because it might develop her personality in ways that are far too aggressive and ruin that meek and quiet spirit that God's asking her to develop. Yes, I know a lot of women that are very good at management, that are very good even at singing. Oh, you should hear my daughter, Audrey. Yes, Audrey is very good at singing, but that doesn't mean she should be the next song leader at church services. It's not something you do because you're good at it. It's something you do to fill a role that keeps everything in perfect balance and order. And that is the focus of 1 Corinthians 14, the idea that there needs to be an order to our worship assemblies when we come together. And it says specifically that some people need to be silent in that situation. And I'm not talking just about women. I'm talking if you had a tongue that you wanted to speak in, but there was no one there to interpret for you, you need to be silent, it says. We're talking about a man here that has a prophetic gift. He's told not to use it right then because it wouldn't help everybody. It wouldn't be in the greater good. The same thing is said of someone that has like a third or a fourth prophecy they would like to give to the congregation. Third and fourth, no. You can only prophesy by 2 or 3, and that in turn, it says, and let the rest be silent. So then when it comes down later to saying a woman should be silent in the assembly of the church, in the church, and that it's a shame for her to speak, it's not giving her some sort of direction that it doesn't give anyone else. It's just saying, yeah, you could do wonderful things. Yes, women had the gift of prophecy that they could use. I have to think they probably had gifts of tongues and other things also, but there was a time to use it. And it says there in that chapter that the spirits of the prophets are subject to the prophets. You can control yourself, even when you were inspired by God to do something. So ladies, all I'm doing is begging of you, learn how to control yourself. That is our constant struggle with sin in so many different forms. Trying not to do everything we just want to do, or that we think we're able to do, or we think we're better at than somebody else is. We need to stop and ask, is this something that is my realm, that is my area, or should I hold back so that someone else can bloom and become a better leader and a better person to fill that role?
Totally agree. Totally agree. We're here to love and be loved, not to show how well we use our talents in the public worship. Yeah, the goal of our instruction is love from a pure heart. And frankly, I am so grateful that this was part of God's plan for the church, that men would be the leaders in public worship. I've got some children to tend to. I mean, my husband does too, but I have really enjoyed just being at worship and soaking in what I'm hearing and learning there, and not going there. And you know, it's for me, it has always been a blessing to have a break from the responsibilities, and just to open my heart and pour it out to God during worship. Really thankful to be relieved of anything more than that.
Good point. So on the occasions that I've spoken at Ladies' Day or Ladies' Class, there's such a responsibility to make sure that what you're teaching is all of the gospel, and that it's all right. And I just have such a respect for men that either speak occasionally or speak regularly, and always have that responsibility on them. So it's not something that I have a need for on a regular basis, but I just am so thankful to God that the job that I have is the one that I have. So, and I think that the points that you're making are really very good, Laurie. Thank you.
Well, there's a reason why James 3:1 says, "Let not many of you become teachers, my brethren, knowing that as such we will incur a stricter judgment." There is a responsibility placed on leadership that we must not discount. It's not all fun and games. You've heard the phrase, heavy the head that wears the crown. The responsibility that it goes along with that is a hard thing. Now, that's hard. Leadership is hard. Submission is hard as well. Neither one of those is necessarily an easy cakewalk. It's something, though, that we have to set our minds to do. And like I said, the whole thrust of the Bible in terms of being a Christian who's following Jesus is that you learn how to be a person that's not pushing yourself forward. When Jesus was with his apostles, can you think of the number of times that he said something to them about how it's not about being first? They would argue about who was going to be the greatest in the kingdom. And Jesus frequently was telling them, that's not what it's about. When you look at Philippians 2, we're told there for everyone to learn to be submissive to each other, that you make Paul happy, but that it's something that is done to increase his love, the fellowship and the spirit, the affection, the compassion. It makes him joyful for people to be of the same mind and the same love, and then not doing anything, verse 3, by selfishness or empty conceit, but with humility, regarding one another as more important than yourselves. You're looking out for that other person and what they need. This is not just talking to women. This is a general admonition to Christians. Let me jump back for just a second while we're talking about that to Ephesians 5. We talked about how wives were to be submissive there in verse 22. It talks about how husbands are supposed to love and sacrifice for their wives in verse 25. But verse 21 had also said, be subject to one another in the fear of Christ. So this is a reflexive sort of relationship we're all supposed to have. I have never been part of a congregation where there were men there wanting to lord any sort of leadership over women. Have you ladies?
No.
No, I know people are afraid that's going to happen, and that's why they don't want to give in. But honestly, maybe in the world, that's the sort of thing you'd have to worry about a little bit more. But these are Christians. These are our brothers in Christ. These are people who are also trying to follow him. Why be paranoid that they're going to want to mistreat us or treat us poorly, not consider us and our needs? They wouldn't be acting right if they did that. So trust them, love them, and trust them. Whenever you love somebody, you make yourself just a bit vulnerable to them. They know how to hurt you. They know the things that you like, but they know the things that you need as well. And when it comes to our relationships in the church, yes, we're supposed to be serving each other. That was a strong point that Paul was making to the Philippians in Philippians 2. But remember, in Mark 9, verse 35, Jesus also said that it's not about who's going to serve. You want to be greatest in the kingdom? Be the servant of all. And that's what we can capitalize on. Luke 14, verses 7 through 11, Jesus talked about how when you go into a feast, don't take the greatest seat. Don't take that position of honor for yourself. Sit in a lowly place, and when the host comes, they'll elevate you. He wraps all of that up by saying, when you're submissive and humble to God, God will raise you up at the proper time. That's what we need to be looking for, is God's elevation.
Amen. Amen. Yeah, submission teaches us selflessness. I mean, it is so ironic that it is the key to happiness, but when you're working along, well, I brought up the laws of nature before. When you're working along with the laws of nature in a way that respects them, things function. Same thing when you're working God's plan for the husband-wife relationship and submission being a part of that. You will be running your life according to the Creator's directions, and it is a happy life. It is not a fearful life, because we have husbands that are reading the scriptures that say submit to one another, and all day, every day, my husband is suppressing his first, desires and saying, yes, yes, as you wish, as you wish, as you wish, as you wish. And so when he finally has something, hey, I see this differently, here's why. I think we need to go, this direction instead of that. And I would present mine like, I disagree, and here's why. He'd be like, I understand. Thank you for expressing that. We still need to go this other direction. It's my turn. Because all day, every day, he has been laying down his life for me. Do you know how deeply in debt I am to this man? Like, I'm in love debt up to my ears after 40 years. So once in a while, he says, we're going this other way. And I'm like, And, I feel like I've paid down about $10 off of billions of dollars of love debt to him. So that's what it's supposed to look like, that cycle that you're describing from the scriptures.
One comment that we have says, I love having Christian men leading us. I so appreciate all they do for the church. It's a hard job. And that's so correct. It's so proper that when the Christian men, like you said, that are leading us, that are listening to us in the congregation, that is such a blessing for us, and God's plan. Absolutely God's plan.
Yes, yes, yes.
Okay. One last thing I have to say. I know we're getting a little long here, but this is the main point I'd like to make sure everybody knows. That's why I started off saying it, because I figured this might happen. But when we think about submission, I think our biggest focus needs to be, and I've been saying it the whole time just so that we wouldn't totally slip, that what we're doing is modeling the submission of Jesus. Let me just point out exactly what I'm talking about here. Christ is God. All of the power, all of the rights, the holiness, all of that. And yet he chose to be born into the body of a child, to grow here in this world, and to give us the example. That's the way John 1 puts it. When the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, we beheld his glory, that of the only begotten of the Father, there in verse 14. We see God when we see Jesus. And that's why it's so important to study our Bibles. When Jesus reacted a certain way, when he was patient with people who were not doing what was right, even with his apostles who were not being as humble as they should, when he took the ridicule and waited for the Father to make final judgments instead of pushing back himself and getting irate, that is what we need to be doing, and we need to model that. And so that's why when we think about Hebrews 12, those first 3 verses are very similar to 1 Peter 2 that we read before. We have these people watching us, these heroes of faith that Hebrews 11 had talked about, and we need to run the race that's in front of us with ourselves fixing our eyes on Jesus. He wrote the book on how it is we're supposed to be acting. And for the joy that was set before him, he endured the cross. Heaven is going to be such a joy. There is no way we could be asked to do anything in this world that would not be worth the final joy that we would have in heaven. When Jesus was there enduring the cross, he despised that shame. The mistreatment that he got, he wasn't happy about it, but he went through it. He endured it. And he sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider verse 3 says, him who has endured such hostility by sinners against himself, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. Sometimes we get tired of doing what's right. I understand that because it's not easy. Jesus went through some wearying experiences, even there in the Garden of Gethsemane at the end. The absolute hardship and the hard heartbreak that he went through, knowing what was coming in front of him, that is amazing to me that he went through with it. But if he could do that, this is nothing. What I do in my life, the idea of being a helper and a support to other people around me, that's nothing compared to what Jesus showed we should be focused on doing. And so I would just like to encourage everyone, especially the women in the churches, to think about the service that you do as becoming closer and closer to the image of God, closer to doing what Jesus did.
We're here to prepare for eternity, and being in submission helps us to learn to not make an idol out of our preferences. Yes, it prepares us to see God face to face, this imitation of Christ. What a beautiful life to follow in his footsteps and attempt to do the best we can to imitate the divine virtues that made him such a beautiful Savior.
He went through hardships, to be sure, but he didn't just endure life and was miserable here. I think there were probably many, many things he enjoyed. And when we think about the book of Ecclesiastes, there are so many things in this life we can enjoy and God gave to us to enjoy. Let's think about the things that are right and pure and holy and the things that build up, not the things that we might consider negatives.
Absolutely. It is a full and happy life being a Christian woman under the leadership of a faithful Christian husband. It is a joy. God is always right. God's way works no matter what you're talking about. God's way makes for a happier, fuller life. And we want that for all the young women. That's exactly what we want for you, is a full and happy life. And this is where it's at. This wisdom is ancient. This has always been true. The trend right now in books that are being written There are a lot of lies floating around on this topic. So again, fix your eyes on Jesus. Listen to God. He's the creator. He knows what's going to work.
Okay, what if you're not married to a good, loving man who is trying to do what's right for Christ? Does that mean you don't have to listen to him? You don't have to submit to him? That's not what 1 Peter 3 said. When in verse 1, it told the wives to be submissive to their own husbands. It says that even if any of them are disobedient to the word, they may be won without a word by the behavior of their wives. Your submission and your meek and quiet spirit is something that is an evangelism tool. People can see you being the sort of person you need to be, and it can make them stop and question and pursue the righteousness that you're trying to emulate. So it's a win-win in every sense. Sometimes it might take a little longer. Sometimes there might be a little bit more enduring involved, but that's not the important part. The important part is the goal at the end.
And I would also encourage those who have not yet married that are listening to marry someone to whom you feel like you can submit. And by that, I mean, marry someone whose wisdom you admire, whose judgment you trust, and whose kindness is constant. In other words, marry a man, not a boy.
Right.
And you can measure, like, oh, is he a man or is he a boy? You can measure his maturity by how selfless he is.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the questions that we got in our comments, and that I've read also in other venues of objections to being in subjection, is it seems to give license to an abusive husband. What is your response? It's kind of an off the cuff, I know, Laurie, but
no, not at all.
Right.
And I think, honestly, it's the 1 Peter 3 answer. No matter how he treats you, when you do what you know is right, you will prick his conscience eventually. It may be a long game that you're in for, but there's no alternative. There really is no other way to do it and do it right.
Mm-hmm. But it does sound, Cindy, like a topic for a longer program, perhaps, for us at a future time, because there are so many questions. And I read once that happy families are happy all in the same way, but unhappy has their own, everybody has their own unhappy. So, you know, that it's certainly not a simple issue on a case-by-case basis, but you can't get around what 1 Peter tells us. So that's absolutely right. So
I guess I would add one more thought to that. I mean, I was a domestic violence resource advocate for 7 years. So in the middle of the night, the police would call me out to be with women who sometimes it was attempted murder and this kind of thing. So, I mean, abuse has a wide span. And I would say, you know, I think about Proverbs 31, she does him good and not evil all the days of his life. If you're with a man who's life-threatening to be around, it's a good thing for him to have accountability. It is a good thing. This is not a secret that you need to keep. He needs the men of the congregation around him. He needs anger management, and I think to call 911 on those circumstances where you literally are. It's a life and death situation. It is good for him to have court mandated anger management classes. I think that's doing him good all the days of his life. It's good for him to have accountability in the church, and lawbreakers are to be reported. So that's my take on that, and I'm open to correction. If I'm off on that, you know, I'm always changeable, but that's how I see it.
Well, our first accountability is always to God, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
And if this behavior you're speaking of is not what God has said a man needs to do, then you're right. There has to be some form of intervention there.
Well, we appreciate so much, Laurie, you're being with us, and we look forward to having you to come back again real soon. And I don't have the dates in front of me right now, but you've just presented so much good information for us, for all of us. And we've got really good comments that you'll get to read later on, I'm sure. We want to be sure that we remind our viewers to watch the Answering Religious Error program on Tuesdays at 8 p.m. and on Wednesday, their live Q&A at noon. Thank you again so much for being with us, Laurie and Cindy. Happy trails. Where are y'all now? I don't know where Cindy is now, so we'll talk to y'all later. Bye-bye.
Thank you.